hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream of History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Cooney. And today we're talking about her book titled When Women Ruled the World, Six Queens of Egypt. So welcome back to the show, Cara.
Thanks for having me on, Jacob. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining me. So I'd like to start off with the first of the six that we're going to be talking about, Merit-Neith. Why is he called the bloody one or something like that? Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I called her Queen of Blood. And we don't know exactly how the ancient Egyptians pronounce these names, but her name Merit-Neith means the one who is beloved of the goddess Neith. And she was thought to be a man because her tomb was discovered in the royal burial grounds of Abydos in a sequence of other kings. And so when her tomb was found, she had a stela in front of it. She had sacrificial burials, or what we think were sacrificial burials. And she had a grand tomb filled with wine from the Levant and other offerings. And it was assumed that she was a king until a tiny label was found in the tomb of her son next door that called her king's mother. And so it was clarified that she actually was not a king. And she's the only one in the book, When Women Ruled the World, who is not actually a female king. The Egyptians use the word king for these women. They don't use the word queen. Queen denotes no power. And when these women reached the highest pinnacle of power, they did call them king. Merit-Neith, however, was not a king. And the reason I call her Queen of Blood is to clarify the point that just because a woman is ruling in a general system, if it's a patriarchal system, she is still going to serve that patriarchy and act in the ways that patriarchy demands. And in the first dynasty, most Egyptologists agree that there was some sort of human elite sacrifice going on, that when the king died, they would take a collection of courtiers, priests, and even family members of the king and determine which one should accompany the king into death, and then dispatch them in some way. How they did that is not completely known. I could talk more about that. But Merit-Neith, as the regent acting on behalf of her son, Den, who was too young to rule, must have made the decision on his behalf and decided who would live and who would die when her husband, King Jet, died before anyone expected him to. And you see in that tomb, according to early Egyptological examinations of the bodies, that it's possible there were more masculine courtiers and individuals put to death than feminine. And that may have been a way of keeping the throne safe for her son. This is a story that's 5,000 years old. There's a lot of conjecture, a lot of hypothesizing. But Merit-Neith was one of the earliest women in power. And it's such an interesting thing to see that as soon as kingship is born in ancient Egypt, a very strong queenship accompanies it. And she's just one of the first in a long line of very strong queens who accompanied their kings.
Do we know anything about how she came to power?
Not really, no. You can't... We don't really know a lot about how Thutmose III came to power. We don't know a lot about how Ramses II came to power. And those are kings who ruled thousands of years after Merit-Neith. The best solution, the best conclusion one can make is to say that Merit-Neith came to power because she was part of the dynasty. She was related to those in power. She was part of that lineage, part of that family. And as kingship was developed in ancient Egypt and in other parts of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, they looked to family lineages until that lineage or dynasty was brought to an end, either internally or externally. And Merit-Neith was probably the daughter of a king. She's not named as such in any of the documents that I know of, but she was probably the daughter of a king. She was certainly the wife of a king, and she may even have been the sister of a king. She could have married her half-brother. That kind of incestuous relationship is not documented for the first dynasty in a clear way, but it would make sense that if one is trying to maintain power, they keep the power in the family, even when it concerns lineage and the next generation.
And now I'd like to shift to Neferu Sobek. What do we know about her?
So to get to Nefer Sobek, you actually have to skip from Dynasty 1, around 3000 BCE from Merit-Neith, all the way to around 1800, 1850 for the end of the 12th dynasty and Nefer Sobek. And Nefer Sobek is a really interesting woman, the first documented case of a woman becoming nothing less than king. She is called king, and in the one remaining statue that we have of her in the Louvre in Paris today, it shows a headless woman. The head is gone, unfortunately, but it shows that not only is she called king on the documentation, on the inscription, but she has the remains of a Nemi's headdress that you can see the lappets of. So she wore a king's headdress, and then she also wore the king's shendit kilt. So she maintains her femininity because the breasts and a woman's dress are clearly seen in the statue, but she ties on the kilt. She puts on the Nemi's headdress, and so she layers on the elements of kingship onto her female person. And then you may be asking, well, how and why was she allowed to do this? What's her situation? Well, Neferu Sobek, whose name means Sobek is beautiful, or maybe her name means the beautiful one of Sobek. You could do it either way. She was of the lineage of these important kings of the 12th dynasty, kings who are named Amenemhet or Senwosret. And she's the end of this lineage. And it seems that while her grandfather Senwosret III was extraordinarily powerful and extended Egypt's power all the way to up to Syria in the Levant and all the way down to the Third Cataract down in Nubia, he was expanding Egypt's territories and hegemony. And his son Amenemhet III, Amenemhet III, continued that expansion of hegemony and continued to bring vast wealth and riches into Egypt. After the reign of Amenemhet the third, you get this shady and unknown king that we Egyptologists call the fourth Amenemhet IV. And he seems to have been married to Neferu Sobek. And then all of a sudden, Amenemhet IV goes away. There's not much evidence for him. He's not really got a strong record in the history annals that we have preserved to us, in the monuments and the temples and things like that. And then all of a sudden there is evidence that Neferu Sobek herself was named king. And it does seem that for whatever reason, the 12th dynasty didn't have anyone to take the throne, didn't have a strong masculine entity, a son, to take the throne after Amenemhet IV died. Certainly even after Amenemhet III died. This Amenemhet IV, it's not clear exactly who he is. So let's throw him out and say there was no Amenemhet IV. Egyptologists argue about these things all the time. There was no strong king after Amenemhet III, who ruled for multiple decades and was quite strong. And then all of a sudden we move to this female kingship. And one wonders, how could there be no crown prince to occupy the throne? How could, with all of the power and the wealth and everything this 12th dynasty of Egypt had, how could they not have a crown prince to take the place of the strong kings who had occupied it before? And I would suggest, though I can't prove it, I would suggest that incest played a role, because the kings did marry their sisters, according to documentation that we have from earlier in the 12th dynasty and during the mid part of the 12th dynasty. And it seems quite likely that with generations of incest, and the kings being themselves the product of that incest, that it's quite possible that Amenemhet IV, whoever he was unable to produce children. And Neferu Sobek herself seems to have been unable to produce a son, because she's there occupying the throne as a woman. Now, the extraordinary thing that happens is that Neferu Sobek occupies the throne, is named king. All the courtiers do what she asks them to do. All the orders are obeyed. But she only rules for 2 to 4 years. It's not clear for how long, but it's less than 5 years. And with her death, however that happened, the dynasty ends. The family lineage is over, and we have no real follow through. There's no heir of Neferu Sobek. She doesn't bring in another husband or lover and produce another possible heir to the throne. It seems that the dynasty is allowed by the elites and courtiers and priests and all of the stakeholders of ancient Egyptian power to continue to its bitter end. And then the throne passes to what Egyptologists call the 13th dynasty. And there you see that an intermediate period of crisis has set in. There is government collapse. There is not as much wealth. The hegemony that ancient Egyptian kings had built is now withering, and there is no more control of the Levant or of Nubia up to the Third Cataract. And so you see a very interesting set of patterns. One, that when a woman is allowed to rule as king in Egypt, if she's ruling alone, she will only rule for a short period of time, and she will leave no legacy. And two, when there is crisis, some sort of environmental collapse, which we suspect happened at this time, economic collapse, political collapse, that a woman is often brought in because there are no men left to take the place on the throne. And however that happens, we humans in patriarchal societies very much associate female power with crisis. And so I encourage your listeners to ask themselves, is female rule, does it bring in the crisis, or is it only allowed or invited during times of crisis? It's a very topical question, I would say.
So what you're saying is that typically the male in the family was preferred to be the ruler, but unless there are extraordinary circumstances that merit putting a woman in power, they usually won't do so.
Yeah, you got it. And the main, and I think this would be any patriarchal system anywhere. I think one of the best comparisons for us to look at would be pre-modern Europe. You could look at Catherine the Great, or earlier than that. You could look at Mary the First, Elizabeth the First of the Tudor family, and see how when a family only has a woman to offer within their lineage, that woman is still preferred than giving up the kingship itself to another family. So when you see women on the throne or women in power, I would encourage you to think of it as the woman being the head of a cooperative system of power. It can be a family system, as in a kingship or queenship, but a family lineage like Tudor England, or Neferu Sobek. But you could also look at something like modern India and see the Gandhi family, and see that if there's an assassination, then a woman might be able to step forward and take the prime minister position. And she's still there as a representative of a larger family whole, a dynasty, you might even say. And that still fits a pattern. Or if you look at other women in power who are able to take the reins of power without too much trouble, I would look to parliamentary systems that name a number of men through voting, men and women, to representative positions in the parliament. And then the parliament, as a cooperative body, might choose a woman to rule on their behalf. There you might see a woman like Margaret Thatcher or Theresa May ruling on behalf of a cooperative, on behalf of a group. It's not a family, but it's a cooperative that will see, in certain circumstances, a woman as being their best shot at keeping and maintaining rule. But it's something that happens quite rarely. And in patriarchal systems, when people are given the option in a more direct democratic system, one vote, one person, let's take the American Electoral College out of it for a second, there is a great squeamishness about putting women into positions of power, and men are greatly preferred, even in an organic democratic voting system. which is certainly something to think about. Ask oneself why and what the reasons for that might be.
And now I'd like to shift to discussing Pharaoh Hatshepsut. What do we know about her and how she came to power?
Yeah, for Hatshepsut, your listeners might be interested in knowing that I wrote a book on her particularly, and it is what you might call a speculative history, where I'm trying to follow this woman from cradle to grave and beyond, and trying to understand why she made the decisions that she made, who the main players in her orbit were, how she was able to grasp power, and what that power may have meant. And to tell a very long story short, I'll say that Hatshepsut was a king's daughter. She was a king's sister. She was a king's wife, great royal wife, because she also married her half or full brother, to be determined. I wasn't kidding about the incest stuff in the 12th dynasty, or arguably the first dynasty before it. And what she never became was a king's mother, because she married this little known and short-lived king, her half-brother, Thutmose II. We name him the second of the Thutmose kings. And he only ruled for about 3 years. She was his great royal wife. And they had one child, the two of them. And that child was a daughter, not a son. And so when Thutmose II died precipitously, and we don't exactly know how, but his mummy shows the possible scars of smallpox. And so people say, oh, he could have died in some sort of epidemic scourge. It is completely possible. Not being a bioarchaeologist, I'm going to leave that for others to discuss. But she and all of Egypt are left with a situation in which there are only toddlers who could take the throne after Thutmose II's death. We have 2-year-olds, because he was only on the throne for 3 years. So children produced from the time that he was made king are quite young. And so Egypt launches itself into following Hatshepsut as their ruler. She does not become king yet. She is known as, they don't even call her anything, strangely. We call her a queen regent. And they do call her queen. They call her king's sister. She also occupied a very, very important priestess position, known as the god's wife of Amun. And in this position, she had her own courtiers, her own economic power, her own foundation of power. And as that, she was able to be the decision maker for all of Egypt. So I don't cough. Hold on. Okay, good. So she's the main decision maker for all of Egypt, and is making decisions on behalf of the next king. Imagine a toddler king. We'll call him Thutmose III. That's what Egyptologists call the heir of Thutmose II. Menkhepere was his Egyptian throne name. And she is not his mother. She is his aunt. And she's only his aunt because she married her brother or half-brother. So she is ruling on behalf of a child who is not her own. And let me step back a little and explain that, apologies, that the 18th dynasty was a time when the sons would, hold on, I'm muting myself. Okay, I know everyone's sick out there too. Okay, good. So
You
the
all right?
18th, yeah, I'm sorry. So
That's
the
all good.
18th dynasty was a time period when the crown prince would come to the throne quite young. And there were lots of queen regents. And these queen regents did not become king. They ruled because their sons were too young to rule. Hatshepsut finds herself in exactly that position. It's not that unusual. It's unusual that she's not the queen mother doing it. And imagine a mother of a young king. She's the one who's able to tell the new king to sit up straight, to listen to what she says, to learn his papyrus writing, and to learn his statecraft. She can be strong in that way, but she's also not going to try to take the kingship from her son, generally. There are some Roman examples that might speak against that, but an emperor position in Rome is a different thing from kingship in Egypt. Every other queen regent stepped back from the regency, allowed her son to grow into it. Merit-Neith is the first example that we talked about, right? But Hatshepsut doesn't do that. In year 7 of Thutmose III's reign, Hatshepsut steps forward and is named king, female king, nothing less. Like Neferu Sobek before her, she wears the Nemi's headdress, she ties on the Shendit kilt of a man, and she continues her rule as king, even though there is another king on the throne. And now it gets really interesting because you have a kingship pair. You have the king who's in the primary position, Hatshepsut, who is there in front of the ritual. Thutmose III is behind. She's there making the decisions. He's listening to what she has to say. Even though he came to the throne first, she came second. And then when she dies, which she does eventually do, and we don't know the manner of her death, she is buried in state by Thutmose III. And no child of hers becomes king after. She has no legacy because Thutmose III is already there. And it's his child who will become his son, who will become king after him. So Hatshepsut shows us another pattern that when a woman occupies the throne for a very long period of time, and Hatshepsut occupied the throne for some 22 years, including her regency and her kingship, when she occupies the throne for a very long period of time, she's not there alone. She's there with a partner. And in her case, she has Thutmose III, who is always there during her kingship. And when she dies, he continues to be there. So Hatshepsut comes into power because of a crisis of a king too young to rule. And why she maintains her power as king after the regency, that's where it gets really tricky. And that's why I wrote that whole book trying to figure out what it was that allowed her, made her, encouraged her to take the kingship rather than just being there as regent and stepping back into the shadows when Thutmose III was old enough to do it on his own. Something happened, and we don't know exactly what that was. So yeah, Hatshepsut's story will continue to be very, very interesting.
And what about Nefertiti?
Nefertiti is the one who I have. She is the one who I have on the brain now, because I'm working on, I think, a new book with National Geographic Books on Nefertiti, trying to learn and understand her story. If she was elevated to king, in her case, co-king and then maybe sole king. If she was elevated to co-king, she is the only one in our story out of the 6 women that we're talking about who was elevated by her peer, by her husband, within a marriage as great royal wife. Nefertiti seems to have been plucked from obscurity in year 4 of a king who had himself renamed Akhenaten. And many of your listeners probably know Akhenaten. He's the world's first documented monotheist. He had a new religion created. He probably created himself, a religion that eschewed all icons and statuary and instead looked directly to the sun in the sky. And he claimed to be the prophet of that solar orb and the only one who could speak for that solar entity. And he brought Nefertiti into his life as great royal wife. He probably had her renamed. Her name means the beautiful one has come. And she is depicted on equal scale with him. She's given a very unusual, unique crown, the blue crown, in her case, not the king's blue crown. It's a cylinder that goes back and then has a flat top cut at an angle. And she, at a certain point in Akhenaten's reign, maybe around year 10, though this is disputed, she became co-king alongside him and received a new name, Nefer-Neferu Aten. Quite a mouthful to say all at once. But she seems to have been depicted and ruled alongside her husband Akhenaten. And all of your listeners should be then asking, well, what was the crisis that demanded that Nefertiti come into power? Whenever a woman comes into power in a patriarchal society, you should ask, what's the crisis? And in her case, I would say the crisis is one of Akhenaten's own making. It's a crisis of his ideological experimentation, a crisis of his new religion, a crisis of elites who probably don't want to go along with everything that he's telling them to go along with. And he needs someone he can trust, someone he can rely on, who's not going to try to undercut him or try to do something else. Nefertiti, for her part, she doesn't really have any foundation of power beyond her husband Akhenaten. So she's a perfect choice for him. How she felt about the deal is something we will never know until we get our time machine technology organized. But yeah, she went along with all of the religious experiments of her husband Akhenaten, from all that we can tell. But upon his death, and again, we don't know how he died, upon his death, it seems, and here, if you ever want to start a bar fight, I always say amongst Egyptologists, sneak up to the bar and say, was Nefertiti co-king, or sorry, sole king after the death of Akhenaten, and then back away slowly and see what happens. But it seems that it is possible that Nefertiti was king after the death of Akhenaten. The throne name that she took on as co-king is Ankheprure. And the king who ruled after Akhenaten's death has that same throne name, Ankheprure. There's another name added in addition, and that name is Smenkhare. And Smenkhare is depicted as a man. Smenkhare has a great royal wife in certain tomb scenes. And because of that, many Egyptologists have said, well, it can't have been Nefertiti. Nefertiti is a woman and Smenkhare is a man, so it's got to be somebody else. And there is great debate and great discussion. I would caution everyone to think about Hatshepsut, who by the end of her reign felt the need to masculinize her person, to show herself in her reliefs and in her statuary as a man. Topless in rituals, not wearing a shirt, no hint of breasts, a masculinized jaw, very strong biceps, pecs, and other shoulder muscles. It is then possible, is it not, that Nefertiti, only a few generations after, would know the example of Hatshepsut, and once she became sole king, follow that example and show herself as a man to fill that position of king alone better. The other thing that fits if she was sole king is that she ruled for a very short time while she ruled alone. She takes on a great royal wife, but that doesn't really count in terms of ruling in partnership. She's not ruling as a co-king with another masculine entity. She's there alone on this throne, and she doesn't last for very long. Maybe a year, maybe less, maybe a little more. It's not quite clear. But Egypt is plunged into a different kind of crisis at the end of the 18th dynasty, because then we move into the reign of Tutankhamun after Smenkare's death, whether it was Nefertiti or not. We know that we move into the reign of Tutankhamun, and the 18th dynasty really does find its way to a slower end, but it does extinguish the dynasty, because then you have a courtier named Ai who takes power after Tutankhamun, and then a military general, Horemheb, who is able to start a new dynasty and link himself to the generals like Ramses I and Seti the First, who will be able to create the 19th dynasty. So, as with Neferu Sobek, the rule of a woman ends a dynasty. If a woman rules alone for a very short period of time, we shouldn't be surprised that her rule was a crisis so disruptive that the dynasty ends with her.
And what about Tausret or Tausret?
Yeah, Tausret is a really interesting one. And whenever I'm doing public speaking about Tausret, I say I don't have time to discuss this story. It's too complicated. It's a really great story. It would make for a great television show. Tausret is a 19th dynasty female king, and you can visit her tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It's a tomb that was taken over by and I said name Setnacht instead of, no, I think I did it okay. Yeah, Setnacht. So her tomb is taken over by the man who probably killed her, Setnacht, the first king of the 20th dynasty, and Tausret is the last king of the 19th dynasty. And it seems she was put into power by taking a page from the book of Hatshepsut. She was named great wife of Amun, this priestess position, God's wife of Amun, and regent of a young king named Siptah, who was not her son, who was too young to rule on his own, it seems. And once Siptah died, this woman Tausret named herself, or was named, or her courtiers named her king on her own. And this is in the middle of a big civil war. The civil war preceded Tausret. It seems there was a civil war between King Seti II in the north and King Amenmesi in the south. And if you look at my book, When Women Ruled the World, in the chapter on Tausret, I make a pretty interesting link between Amenmesi, who is called Mesu for short, and Moses of the Hebrew Bible. And you can read that and make of it what you will. Little provocative note there, so you can look at that in more detail. But Tausret may have, there's a lot of ink spilled on whether or not Tausret had Siptah, the king under her charge, whether or not she had him killed. It's possible somebody else did it, but she did become king on her own after his death. And then the civil war continued, and she ended up in military activity, we think, against a northern family that was the word mercenary is a difficult word. So let's just say they come from a military community of practice. That's what an academic would say. A bunch of military men are in the family of Setnacht. And Setnacht has a son named Ramses. He's the third Ramses for Egyptologists. And they come in, fight the armies of Tausret, her entourage. They are victorious. They move her from the throne and they claim Egypt on their own. So Tausret fits that pattern of ruling alone, ruling for a very short period of time, and ending the dynasty with no heir of her own. All too common a story. It started with Neferu Sobek, it continued with Nefertiti, and then we see Tausret filling that pattern as well.
And how long did that civil war that you mentioned last, and what caused it?
The Civil War is a really interesting one. And I would say, you know how we're living through a time now in which the boomers and the silent generation refuse to relinquish their power? The Egyptians lived through a similar circumstance in the reign of Ramses II, a man who ruled for 67 some years. By the time Ramses II died, the Egyptians had not just skipped one generation, but 2 or even 3 generations of potential royal candidates for the throne. And you ended up with a circumstance in which dozens of men with equal claim to the throne, with foundations of power throughout Egypt, were able to contest one another and claim the throne. It creates a problem when you skip one generation. When you skip 2 or 3, then you have a whole passel of cousins who are going to be at each other's throats as everyone's trying to determine which family lineage is going to win the day after the reign of Ramses II. It didn't happen right away. When Ramses II died, the kingship did go to his 13th son, Merit-Neith. But then after that, it all starts to fall apart, because after Merit-Neith, it goes to this very old king named Seti II. And we think that he was probably an offspring of Ramses II as well. He doesn't last for very long. And then all of a sudden, this other king from Thebes, from the south, who has his name inscribed all over the Theban region and has a great foundation of power in the south, he rises up. And his name, Amenmeses, Amen birthed him, or Amen created him. It's a very Theban name. But so it seems to be a fight between North and South, which is a typical way that Egypt fragments during crisis, political crisis in particular. How long this lasted? It's probably a civil war that altogether with Tausret involved would have been like 10 to 15 years. If we put all of the upheaval into one basket, Tausret herself probably only ruled for a couple of years altogether. Some would say as long as 4, some would say 2. When there's crisis, it's very difficult to count the reigns because kings aren't able to build as much in terms of statuary and stela where they put a year date. And so if the latest year date that we have is year 2 or year 3, that's the best you can do. And also at the end of one of these periods, all of that material, the tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a stela, a statue, they're reinscribed and the name is erased and that year date is erased and it's given to someone else. And Egyptologists are often reading the palimpsests of other texts, the old scratchings after something has been reused or even smashed up into tiny bits. So it's an interesting time there at the end of the 19th dynasty and going into the 20th, and the crisis continues into the 20th as well, but for a different reason, not because of family lineage or incest or the lack of heirs or too many heirs in the case of Ramses II, but instead because of the Sea Peoples and those invasions and that environmental and political devastation brought on by just the general late Bronze Age collapse.
And what about Cleopatra, and why call her the drama queen?
Yeah, Cleopatra, some would argue shouldn't even be in the book, and they'll say, but she's Macedonian. Why are you putting her in a book about Egyptian female rulers? And I would counter and say that Cleopatra the Seventh, which is what we call her, was the only Macedonian ruler of Egypt who was able to speak and read Egyptian. And because of that, and because so much language knowledge is passed through the mother, many classicists and Egyptologists believe that Cleopatra's mother was Egyptian and that she spoke and read Egyptian. It would indeed make sense because Ptolemy XII, her father, was a bastard himself. And I'm not using the word bastard in anything but the technical term that means he was not born of the legitimate wife of his father, Ptolemy X. And I should also clarify that, interestingly, the Macedonian kings and queens, they outlawed or eschewed harems. So what worked very well to create another heir in the ancient Egyptian pharaonic system, having a harem of wives, and I use the word knowing the problematic associations because I think the women who were exploited in such an institution deserve nothing less. The Macedonian rulers eschewed a harem. They didn't want to be associated with that. Instead, they chose the legitimacy of a Greek monogamous marriage, even if that monogamous marriage was with their own full or half sister or a niece or a cousin. There's a lot of family commingling in this 300-year Ptolemaic dynasty. It doesn't always work, right? Long term, you can't get a healthy issue out of your incestuous coupling. And so we shouldn't be surprised that Ptolemy XII was himself the offspring of the king and some other woman, and that Cleopatra VII was the offspring of Ptolemy XII and somebody else who remains unnamed. There are Egyptologists and classicists who say that her mother was Cleopatra V. I'm not one of them. We'll never really know. But the fact that she doesn't name her mother explicitly as being a Ptolemy makes me suspicious, makes me think, oh, if she didn't want to name it, maybe there's something to hide, right? But so let's include her in this group, and then also bring in the understanding that Egypt changes ways of rule. Take a place like Macedon or Greece as a larger cultural entity, and look to how many women were able to take the throne as the ultimate leader of a polity, a city-state, a region like Macedon. There are none. There are none. The Greek system did not suffer women to rule. They could be there as a queen. They could be.
It looks like she dropped out. Might have been a connection issue. Hmm.
Or in a way that, oh, sorry, this
Yeah,
place
you dropped
needed,
out.
oh, I
So
dropped
if you,
out.
yeah, go back for like 30 seconds.
Yeah, okay. So Greece did not allow women to come into power at all. But in Egypt, even taking this Macedonian cultural system, once you insert that into Egypt, they needed female power. It's a really interesting thing that even all of these Macedonian rulers, as soon as they established their dynasty, they needed a strong queenship alongside it. And you might ask why? Why do you need female power in ancient Egypt in a way that you don't need it in Greece, in Rome, in the rest of the ancient Near East? I would argue that it's because the woman is there as a representative of a family unit. She's there also as an ideological representative of power. And then I would say, most importantly, unlike the ancient Near East or ancient Greece or ancient Rome, once you're in Egypt, you don't need to be a military leader in the same way. And when you remove the military aspect, female power becomes ever more important. Indeed, there's a reason that we go from Tausret of Dynasty 19 and we go all the way to the Ptolemies, because the kings at that point, the Ramessid kings of 1920 up all the way up to Cleopatra, find themselves military men. And it's very hard for a woman to find power through a military system. But if it's a family system that we're talking about, women are equal representatives in a sense, maybe not equal, but they're there as stakeholders within a family system. And so Cleopatra is there, able to rule as the only ruler left standing. So just to give a quick synopsis of her story, and most of your listeners almost certainly know it, Ptolemy the 12th named her as his co-ruler, even though it's his daughter. Doesn't seem that there was any sexual relationship involved there. When he died, his will was read aloud in Rome, and it was determined that she would co-rule with Ptolemy the 13th, her half-brother, which was meant to be a sexual relationship. It was meant to be an incestuous marriage. He went to war with her, so that didn't really work out. When he died in the Battle of Alexandria, she was made to marry, or told to marry, or encouraged to marry Ptolemy the 14th. She had him assassinated. So now there's none left. And we already learned what happens when a woman tries to rule alone. The dynasty ends, there's nothing left. Cleopatra must have known this too. She didn't have my book to read, but it doesn't matter. She was a canny woman, able to figure this out on her own. So if she knows she needs a man by her side, and she knows that she's now no longer in this Egyptian system that is limited to Upper and Lower Egypt, but is now on the edge of the Mediterranean and part of that much larger world, she chooses a Roman warlord, or he chooses her, because she and Julius Caesar create a son together, have a relationship, and create a bastion of power. He has his legions there during the Battle of Alexandria. She's in Rome when he's killed on the steps of the Senate. When he dies, she knows she needs another Roman warlord, and immediately. So she moves on to Mark Antony, Marcus Antonius, and he needs money. She needs a masculine protector, and they are able to rule together in partnership for some time. And if it weren't for, I would argue, as I do in the book, Mark Antony's foolhardy invasion of Parthia, Iran — no one should have a land war in Asia, isn't that what we're always told? If he hadn't done that, Egypt and Egyptian army and navy, just the money that they spent on war would have been that much more fortified. And they almost certainly would have had more chips to play in their battles against Octavian. But instead, there was a bit of panic and quick preparation for the Battle of Actium, which of course we know they lost. And then we read about Marcus Antonius killing himself after this battle, and Cleopatra, of course, is said to do the same. But the provocative element that I include in the chapter on Cleopatra is that I think Octavian murdered her. I think he murdered her, but instead said to his people that she took the hero's way out, that she committed suicide like Marcus Antonius did. And it created a mythology that was very useful for him. A mythology of him not being a woman killer, a mythology of her being a woman who abandoned her children to be hunted down and murdered, of a person, a woman who abandoned her people. And I call her the drama queen, mostly because this is the role that the Romans assigned to her. I don't actually think she's the drama queen. So there's a bit of tongue in cheek in that, in the naming there. But the drama that is assigned to her by Octavian works extraordinarily well for him, makes it seem like he's not going to war with his good buddy Marcus Antonius. He's going to war with the woman who seduced his good friend, who made him lose his good reason. And he's not going to war with his own compatriot, his own fellow Roman. He's going to war with this narcissistic, vainglorious queen who thinks she can have whatever she wants. And that's where we get all of these stories and tales written about her pride, her drama, her narcissism, and so on and so forth. So the story of Cleopatra, I really wanted to tell not through the lens of Rome, but through the lens of Egypt. And I wanted to treat her as all of the other women are treated, using Egyptian evidence primarily, and asking how she fits into the patterns of female power in ancient Egypt.
So what makes you think that Octavian actually had her killed?
I have no evidence, direct. Again, we need that trusty time machine, though. I don't know if I'd want to go back to exactly that moment. I think that would put anyone who did that in great danger. But, you know, when you read the texts about how she killed herself, they're all rather ridiculous and they all disagree. So there's her trying out the poison on different prisoners and, oh, I want the least painful death, so let's try this one. No, that looks too frothy at the mouth. I want that one instead. It serves a purpose, that story. Or there's the story of her having the asp brought into her tomb, into her mausoleum, where she determines that she shall die amongst all of her riches and wealth, which makes her seem as vainglorious and selfish as you could possibly imagine, that she would rather die amongst all of her golden treasures than she would in the embrace of her children, for example. And then there's the discussion of her not wanting to be led in chains in his triumph. And I'm not saying that Cleopatra would have looked forward to being led in chains in a triumph, but it's certainly a way of making her seem extraordinarily selfish, that she can't handle the depredation and the loss of pride at having been marched as a supplicant and an enemy in a Roman triumph. It's so horrible for her, she has to kill herself. All of this works so well to Octavian's advantage. And if he had killed her, I think it would have been potentially very problematic for him. She would have had stories to tell. She was an elite. She could connect with fellow elites. She could release all kinds of information about Marcus Antonius. Removing Cleopatra from the story entirely allowed him to write the script as he liked. It allowed him to demonize Egypt completely. And most importantly, the reason that I think Octavian killed Cleopatra is it allowed him to step in. I'm going to use this term very explicitly, knowing what I'm saying, to step in as the white savior of an African place that was degenerate and badly needed saving, according to his own propagandists. So with the death of Cleopatra at his own hand, though he claims it's not, he's able to come in and put all of his legions in there and provincialize this place, take it as one of the Roman provinces directly. Don't forget, none of us forget that the civil war of Rome was very much about Egypt and its great wealth. You've got all of these triumvirates. You've got men like Pompey. When you had the triumvirate with Julius Caesar, who was, and Pompey, of course, was killed in Egypt, and the head delivered to Cleopatra. I think it's Cleopatra. But the The point is that the Roman warlords, these senatorial combatants who were fighting in civil war against each other, were all vultures circling around the great prize that was Egypt. And when any man tried to take it, like Julius Caesar, he got killed for it. Because as soon as Julius Caesar parked his regiments in Egypt and then had a baby with Cleopatra and invited his girlfriend to come and visit him in Rome, everyone's like, oh my God, he's starting a new dynasty. He's starting a kingship. And he can do it. He's got power unimaginable to any of us because he has all of this grain. He has all of this gold. He has all of this wealth. There are all kinds of reasons given for the murder of Julius Caesar. Most of them are ideological. Most of them are, he is too much of an authoritarian. He's grasping for too much power, right? Nobody says, oh my God, it's because he has so much of Egypt's wealth, he's going to be able to do whatever the hell he wants. That's kind of the answer, though. As soon as he associates himself with Egypt, he puts that target on his back, he gets killed. Mark Antony, soon as he associates himself with Cleopatra, he gets killed. He has all these people coming at him to kill him. And that's the case for him too. Octavian needs to disassociate himself from this powerful ruling family. He needs to take Egypt in a way that's clean, that doesn't involve any statecraft, any diplomacy, any connection with this family, that severs it at the head or pulls it out by the root. And he does do this. He takes her living daughters, he transfers them to Rome. One is married to a king of North Africa. Okay, fine, they're out of the way. He has Ptolemy the 15th, the child of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, murdered through a great deal of subterfuge, getting him to come back from Nubia. And the other sons of Cleopatra with Mark Antony are also rooted out and murdered. So Octavian is able to use this story to such great advantage, the story of her suicide, that I can't believe anything but the fact that he murdered her outright and made it up. And I can't believe I'm the first one to ever actually have said it. Seems rather odd. It just means that we're all thinking with the mind of Romans, are very willing to believe the Roman propaganda and are not looking at it from the Egyptian perspective. I guarantee you that when word spread back to Rome that Cleopatra killed herself, that eyes were rolled and people were like, oh, whatever, I'm sure Octavian had her killed. But it works out better for him as the savior who can come in and take all of that wealth and be like, oh, you guys, okay, let me put it this way. If he kills her and then he's like, oh, all of Egypt's wealth is mine, then he's going to have people coming at him and saying, how dare you take this? If she is said to commit suicide, he steps in and is like, oh my God, you guys, I don't want all of this. This is so much wealth. It's too much for me. I don't even want it. So I'm going to be super careful and conservative with this and let you all know that I'm going to be the best I can be, while simultaneously locking down an autocracy unlike anything Rome had ever seen. It's Egypt's wealth that allows him to become its first emperor, its princeps. It all falls into place for me. So I don't know why people even bother with how she committed suicide. It's all bullshit. So that's how I feel.
S. Mill, thank you for your super chat. Patriarchy entered Middle East from Indo-Europeans in about 3000 BCE. When did that take over Egypt?
I would say patriarchy was probably a little earlier than 3000 BCE. But you are correct that you get the first kingship around 3000 BCE in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, ancient Near East, Elam, places like that. But you have these warring states or warring city-states previous to that, probably as early as 4000, 4500. So I would put the patriarchy there. We have places like Çatalhöyük, we have Göbekli Tepe, and those places don't show a strong patriarchal structure in which you have hierarchies of social inequality and one man is able to hoard all of the wealth and resources. It does take a while for that to develop. So if those places are 10,000 BP, 12,000 before the current 12,000 years ago, then, or sorry, 10,000 BC or 12,000 BP, then I would say it takes another couple thousand years for the real structural patriarchy to develop. And I love the work of Maria Gimbutas on this, a scholar who was vilified by people like Ian Hodder and Lynn Meskel, but whose work is really being resuscitated. And you mentioning the Indo-Europeans is a case in point. So that's really good research there. Yeah.
Excellent music. Thank you for your super chat. Does royalty reflect the power dynamics in common households, i.e., do matriarchies indicate there was no patriarchy in families in everyday life?
So when we ask about matriarchies, it always makes me smile because asking about matriarchies is a patriarchal way of thinking. Does this make sense? The only reason you would expect there to be a matriarchy is because you're thinking patriarchally. You're thinking about hoarding the power. If all the men get power in one system, then all the women must want the power in a different system. The point is that when women have power, they don't hoard it. There is no such thing as a matriarchy because the very concept is patriarchal. And thus, if you could have created a matriarchy, it wouldn't have happened because you're not in a patriarchal system. So the matriarchy never existed, will arguably never exist. There is no such thing. When we talk about matriarchal systems, we're talking about systems in which women share equal or close to equal power with men. It's not a rule by the mothers, right? Patriarchy is a rule by the fathers. It means the men, a small subset of the men, because patriarchy is bad for most men too, they hoard that power and monopolize it and keep it to a very small subset. There is no evidence that women are ever able to do this. And when we talk about matriarchal societies, it would be when there's matrilineage or when women are simply able to have 40% of the political power in like a hunter-gatherer group. For example, the Tongva indigenous group that existed in California previous to Spanish colonialism. Here, because women were able to get as many fish from the river as a man next to them, even if they were pregnant or breastfeeding or menstruating, they had equal power in their elite, or sorry, I shouldn't use the word elite, it's hunter-gatherers, in their ruling councils. Is that a matriarchy? No, it's just a hunter-gatherer situation in which you have a more egalitarian share of power within a binary system. And then I'll also say that this idea of there being a binary between male and female is a patriarchal invention, right? If you ask a biologist who studies sexuality, they'll say, yes, sexuality is a gradient. It's something that we discuss as we watch the Olympics, and you see some men who are more feminized and some women who are more masculinized. Sexuality always occurs on a gradient. Though in a patriarchy, some are able to be exploited for childbirth, others are able to impregnate and create that childbirth. And that's where the binary for the patriarchal division of sexes comes into play. Hunter-gatherers wouldn't really work that way. They wouldn't see just male and female. They would have third gender. They would have many other expressions of sexuality and gender in their cultural ways.
So what is the main reason that you think that Octavian lied that Cleopatra VII killed herself?
Because Octavian's coming out of a situation that has no kingship. Rome had a kingship, but many centuries previous, and it was very distrustful of kingship. And him going in and overtly and aggressively taking power, though it served him directly in terms of getting that power, would not have served him in the very vulnerable situation of creating an authoritarian regime from the ground up. It's very hard as a historian to remind yourself, oh, wait, Octavian's the one creating the imperial system, the Principate. He's the one creating the system of emperors and family lineage that we get with the Augustan Julio-Claudian family. He's the first one. So given that he's in that, he's coming out of a civil war, a very long and brutal, protracted civil war. If he just goes in, kills Cleopatra, holds up the bloody knife and says, hey, you guys, I got her, then they're going to come after him. But if he's like looking at the political landscape, knowing that there are other men in that landscape with armies, with money, who will come after him and saying, oh my goodness, I didn't expect for this to happen. Do you want some money? Do you want some money too? He didn't know she was just going to kill herself like this. Then it works for him in terms of ideologically selling his power to his people. Never forget that power must always be hidden. If you show it outright, then people get jealous, they get angry, they say that you shouldn't have it all. You should always hide most of your power. And you should always lie about how you got your power, or at least veil it in some way. Say, oh, the gods gave it to me, or this is just some stroke of luck that I now have to deal with. It is better to ideologically veil, particularly in a very competitive Roman system, than it is not. If Octavian were a part of the traditional Middle East, and he was coming from a dynasty, and he was a king, there would be no reason to come up with all of this subterfuge and say, oh, she killed herself, and get his propagandists to start talking about it was an asp, or no, it was poison, or no, it was this, or no, it was a knife. It wouldn't matter. And the fact that the Romans are still talking about it in their propagandistic texts more than 100 years after the fact means that people are trying to figure out what's going on while simultaneously upholding a new dynasty that people are probably looking at and going, wait a minute, we're all against kingship in this Roman ideology of ours. Kings are bad. Why are we in a kingship, but we don't call it a kingship? We call it the first among many, right? You're the princeps. So there's all kinds of subterfuge going on in the Roman political system. It's something I think we can understand quite well in our own political system. Whereas a monarchy is just going to be like, yep, I'm a king, kill that king, now that land is mine. The Romans didn't have it so easy. It's not such a simple system. And even once they create an authoritarian system and a dynasty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, it is by no means safe. For those of you that love thinking about Rome, start Google how many Roman emperors met an unnatural death. And you'll find graphs and pie charts and all kinds of fabulous things about how many Roman emperors were murdered or poisoned, or how many we think were poisoned. This was not a good job. This was not a job in which you lasted for a very long time. The amount of competition in Rome was up to here. Octavian knew that. And so he had to work within that system of hyper competition. And the best way to do that is to be like, you guys, I didn't ask for this money. I didn't try to take Egypt. It just kind of fell into my lap. So who's going to share in the wealth with me? It makes all the sense in the world to me, looking at the political system of Rome. I'll never prove it, but it works well.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Cara.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's always so much fun.
Likewise. And I want to remind everybody to go check out her book. The link to purchase the book is in the History Valley Amazon affiliate link, which is contained in the description below. Thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.